Today on Real Talk with Zed, we have Mr. Glenn Martin, CEO and founder of Just Leadership USA. How are you today, sir?
I'm good, thanks. I'm happy to be here.
Okay, could you explain what was the reason for starting Just Leadership USA?
Sure. If you look around this country at criminal justice reform, it's an issue that has impacted 70 million Americans. At this point, you have 70 million Americans that have a criminal record on file. And so the question is, from my perspective as someone directly impacted, why is it that we're not relying on those 70 million people to be a base for criminal justice reform? Instead, we're having a discussion about reform that seems to exclude the very people and communities that can gain most from being a part of the discussion about what reform might look like.
Now, can you talk about the time that you spent at Rikers Island?
Sure.
And what were some of the things that you learned that helped you to become the man you are today?
Sure. When I think about Just Leadership USA and our goal and our mission, particularly our local mission in New York where we're located, although we're a national organization, we have this goal of closing down Rikers. And for me, it's extremely personal as someone who spent time at Rikers at the age of 16 and then again at the age of 23. Rikers Island, I often say that there are some unique things about it as a jail, but the truth is Rikers is every jail and every jail is Rikers. And so when you look at the human carnage that's being produced in that place, for me at least, it goes back 3 decades to when I was 16 and went there and realized quickly that you only have 2 choices to make, predator or prey. And a big part of that environment, that culture of violence, is perpetrated and created by the correction officers themselves. And part of that is the isolation of the facility itself. Part of it is the fact that it was built so close to an airport that the actual architecture and infrastructure doesn't lend itself to the way you would actually build a traditional jail facility. And so even the officers themselves have a difficult time figuring out how to navigate that space and run a safe facility.
Now, talk about right now what's going on as far as you trying to get it to where 160 other youth that are currently incarcerated at Rikers Island move to the Bronx facility, and what's going on with the efforts with that right now?
So we decided as an organization to engage Mayor de Blasio, who has held himself out as this national progressive leader, around the need to actually shutter Rikers Island and replace it with smaller community-based facilities. And while the mayor has yet to be supportive of that initiative that the community is calling for, we also did push him on getting the young people off immediately as a gesture towards advocates who are asking for full closure. And while it took us about a year to get his commitment, he recently put $170 million in the budget toward that effort and made the announcement last week. And the goal for us is not just to move people from one facility to another, but to shrink the population. Part of working to shut down the facility for us is figuring out how to repair some of the damage that's been caused by communities as a result of the facility itself. And so here you have an effort that is funded to move the 16 and 17-year-olds off the island into a smaller, safer, more humane community-based facility, and the mayor has decided to back it. And when the mayor does the right thing, we support the mayor. We're running a campaign with over 90 organizations on board that are calling for closure. And while he hasn't committed to full closure, we believe that when he takes steps in the right direction, that we should be supportive.
Are you frustrated about the timeline right now?
Yeah, people often ask me, am I frustrated about the timeline that it takes to shutter the facility? And unfortunately, that's really out of the mayor's hands. It's actually the ULURP process in New York, which is a land use process. And it often takes many years because there are so many stakeholders that get to weigh in on whether you can use facilities differently. And in this case, one might think it's pretty cut and dry. You're actually taking a facility that once housed 13 and 14-year-olds and using it to house 16 and 17-year-olds. And the reason it's so important is that New York is only one of 2 states that continues to charge 16 and 17-year-olds as adults. And so in any other state, these young people wouldn't be in an adult facility to begin with.
Now, are you able to talk to any of the young people that are currently housed there, and what are they saying to you?
So people often ask whether or not we engage the actual young people at Rikers. I make it my business to visit the island every few weeks, every couple of months, to make sure I'm hearing directly from people that are there. But even more importantly, our campaign itself is made up of people and communities who've been directly impacted by the jail itself. And so we're constantly listening to the opinion and thoughts of people who are directly impacted. And it's a component that's been left out of previous efforts to shutter the island during the Koch administration, and then more recently during the Bloomberg Bloomberg administration, there's been efforts at decentralizing the jail and creating smaller facilities, and the community has been largely left out of those discussions. And so it's been a discussion about the budget, it's been a discussion about the violence, it's been a discussion about the data, but it's missing the key component, which is a discussion about what the community needs and wants. And I learned through being involved in previous efforts that if you leave the community out, the community is going to find a way to be heard regardless, whether it's at the beginning of the process, in the middle of the process, or just before you reach the finish line.
Now, one of the things that the president talked about was the solitary confinement. What are your thoughts behind that?
So the mayor in New York City has bragged about his efforts to reduce solitary confinement on Rikers Island, and I think that they should be applauded for reducing it by hundreds during the administration. But what I would warn the casual observer is to recognize that there are still facilities where people stay in cells for almost 24 hours a day that are not defined as solitary confinement because the cells are constructed in a way that allows people to exit the main cell and go into a smaller cell. And by definition, if you're not in your cell all day, then it's not considered solitary. But I would argue that some of the infrastructure that still exists at Rikers Island, because this was a facility that was built during the height of mass incarceration, still lends itself to the definition of solitary confinement. Whereas the public or any casual observer, anyone using just common sense, would take a look at some of these cells and say, no, this is absolutely solitary. But the mayor gets away, unfortunately, with suggesting that there's only about 160 people left in solitary, and I would argue strongly against that.
Now, did you ever spend time in solitary?
Yeah. So anyone who does time in the system, the majority of folks end up at some point in solitary confinement. Why? Because the system is based on a foundation of punishment. And so the way the system operates and the way the system tries to control people is by using punishment as a leverage, as opposed to using incentives to get people to behave the way they want them to behave. And so, yes, myself, I've ended up in that predicament, but many other people in the system, whether they've done something wrong or not, has ended up in that very same scenario. And by international standards, any time more than 15 days in solitary is considered and defined as torture. And yet here in America, where 70 million Americans have a criminal record on file, and on any given day there's 2.3 million people in the system, we continue to use solitary confinement, locking people up for weeks, months, and sometimes years.
Now, can you talk about the time when you met the president and what was that experience like?
Sure. People often ask me about my experience visiting the White House a year and a half ago, invited by President Obama, and then facing arguably discrimination at the door of the White House based on a 21-year-old conviction. And so I get to the White House to visit after being invited for a policy discussion about criminal justice, and was told that because of a 21-year-old conviction, I wasn't able to gain access to the White House, which led to a conversation with the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal about the experience, which ultimately led to an invitation back to the White House by the president, and then a brief meeting with the president to have a discussion about that experience, which was followed up by efforts by the administration to ensure that that didn't happen to other similarly situated people afterwards. And of course, the discussion with the president was one that was productive, in my opinion. Some of the things that came out of not just that discussion, but continuing to engage the administration, was Pell Grant eligibility for people who are currently incarcerated, and the president signing a ban-the-box order to remove barriers to employment to federal jobs for job seekers with records, and then finally the issuance of guidance from HUD to landlords around how they should be considering applicants with records.
Now we're going to get more into the discussion of a blog that you did one time called Why I Left My Ex. Can you explain that blog?
Sure. There's a blog on Huffington Post called Why I Left My Ex, and the point of the blog, the title obviously is meant to be provocative and get people's attention, but the point of the blog was about language. More recently, we were able to convince the Department of Justice to issue a memo talking about the importance of language and how the department itself would move away from using dehumanizing language to describe people that are in the system. And for me, it's important as an advocate because if you look at any movement in this country, language usually leads the way. The way we refer to people who are oppressed by a system has a lot to do with the way we think about those people, the way we support those people or not. And our criminal justice system refers to people as convicts and prisoners and ex-offenders and inmates. And those are all dehumanizing words given to us by the system to refer to people in the system. And if you're trying to convince Americans that these are human beings that need our support, that need our help, that need treatment, that need community-based services, the word inmate rarely conjures up the kind of feelings that you would be looking for, as opposed to words like father and mother and sister and aunt and child.
I want to talk about a quote that you did once. The closest to the problem are the closest to the solution, but furthest from the power and resources. Explain that.
Sure. Like any other movement, the fact that this one is not led by people most impacted, I'm totally taken aback by, because in my experience talking to people who've been directly impacted by the system, they have a very sophisticated analysis of what worked for them and what did not work for them, and yet they're often not listened to as part of the solution to the problem. So what we do at Just Leadership USA is to identify those formerly incarcerated leaders around the country who are contributing to the solution, but who might be furthest from power and resources. By definition, these are the most marginalized folks in our community, and so even if they have really good ideas, the question is, how do you help those ideas bubble up, and how do you help policymakers to be able to hear and take those ideas into account? And equally important is, how do you get organizations that are working in the space to similarly hear those voices, hire those people, collaborate with those people? How do you get philanthropy to understand that their dollars that are being directed toward this issue also need to be directed close to the ground? Solutions come from the bottom up, not from the top down. There's a need to engage people at the top, policymakers, elected officials, congressional members. I've done legislative advocacy, but what I know is that if there's no foundation of people who've been most impacted by the issue, then you don't have long-term momentum towards the kind of solutions we suggest that we're looking for with some of the bipartisan coalition efforts that are happening on the federal level, and some of the stuff that's happening around the country in state legislatures.
Now I want to move on to the subject of the recent police shootings. I wanted to get your thoughts on that, and is that some of the things that your organization is talking about right now?
So at Just Leadership USA, mission creep has always been important to me. You have to be who you are as an organization, and so while we don't weigh in on policing because it's not our area of expertise, we do have board members who are working in the Black Lives Matter space to ensure that as we think about intersectionality, we're thinking about policing as the feeder into the system. And the truth is, as much of an atrocity as it is when you see these unarmed young black men and black women being killed by police officers, young black men and black women who make it beyond that point, and poor white people who make it beyond that point, end up being killed on the installment plan through our criminal justice system, in and out of jail, in and out of prison, on and off parole, on and off probation, and essentially dying slowly and being further marginalized from a society where having a criminal record becomes the scarlet letter and keeps you away from all of the opportunities that help any American to reach the American dream.
Now, last question. Where would you like to see the Just Leadership USA organization grow within the next 5 to 10 years, and how can people get involved with the organization?
Sure. So we're very deliberately at Just Leadership USA structured as a membership organization so that Americans who believe in our bold and audacious goal have a way to plug in to the work that we're doing through our website at justleadershipusa.org. But when I'm asked the question about where would I like to see the organization in 10 years, my response is I'm not building a leadership organization to continue to lead it a decade from now. My hope is that one of the leaders that we've invested in will emerge as someone who can take the reins and lead the organization and build on top of the success that we've already had in the very short 2 years that we've been around. We've already trained 120 leaders in 23 states, including Alaska, and we're poised to train hundreds more over the next few years. But my hope is that some young, even more bold and ambitious leader emerges from that leadership training program and ultimately takes the program in a direction that I might not have even envisioned when I launched it a couple of years ago.
I really appreciate your time on Real Talk with Zeb, and just for people to know what you're doing down here in Philly for the Democrat National Convention.
So I was invited down here by the Washington Post for a discussion about the Democratic platform and their criminal justice portion of that particular platform. It's the first time a major party has come out with some of the recommendations that are included in the platform. As an organization at Just Leadership USA, we put out a statement to that effect that we were heartened to see that the Democratic Party put out such a platform. But the truth is both parties now are weighing in on the need for criminal justice reform. But we believe as an organization that if there's no grassroots movement behind those pronouncements, then all you really have is a set of statements that have no real momentum behind them. So I'm here as an opportunity to get the word out that there are people really close to the ground who are hoping and depending on this party's promises to do things like eliminate prison privatization and find other ways to solve societal problems, addiction issues, mental health issues without using prison as the first response.
Thank you for your time today.
Thanks for the opportunity.
All right.